All the work's done?
Number 438. We'll sing the first and last verses of My Hope is Built on Nothing Less. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly lean on Jesus' name. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. When he shall come with trumpet sound, oh, may I then in him be found, dressed in his righteousness alone, faultless to stand before the throne. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. Thank you. Testing? Testing? Is it on? Can y'all hear me okay? Is the microphone working? Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. All right, if you would, join me in your Bibles. Let's go together to the book of Matthew. We'll go to chapter 7, or start in chapter 7. And our song that we sung together was a little bit of a segue into this parable that Jesus tells starting in verse 24 of Matthew chapter 7, about a wise man and a foolish man. You know, it's interesting. One of the things that I like to do if I'm preparing for a lesson, of course, one of the best things that you can do if you're going to get in front of people and try to sound a little bit like you know what you're talking about, or if you're going to direct some thinking on a topic, go out and see what other people have said. What have other people done on that topic? And so when you start to go through and research and look at the information that's out there, of which there's a lot on this particular parable that you see in Matthew chapter 7, starting in verse 24, that Jesus tells of a wise man and a foolish man, these two builders that had the same opportunity but ended up with different conclusions. There's just a ton of information out there, but the interesting thing is that most of that information is geared towards, as you can imagine, kids. There's a ton of stuff out there really directed towards kids on this particular parable. In fact, if you went and Googled some variation of this parable, wise man and foolish man, parable of the two builders, you just get pages and pages and pages of object lessons for kids, YouTube videos for kids, all kinds of little songs and stuff that are perfect for VBS. And I think in part, number one, it's one of those great foundational stories, pardon the pun, but I've got a lot of construction puns for you today. It's one of those great foundational stories that can help sort of concrete and crystallize a young person's faith, and so you get them a lot, especially with young people. They can understand it. It can be a very animated story or parable, as brief as it is. But the reality is that there's a lot of depth to this particular parable. One of the things that sometimes we forget because we become so accustomed in our Bible study and in our practice and our review of biblical text. Sometimes we're very quick to just open the Bible and point to a particular verse or a particular passage. Nothing wrong with doing that necessarily. Sometimes we're having a discussion with somebody and we want to just sort of suggest something, make a point, bring something to somebody's mind. And so we say, well, let's go look at this verse, or let's look at this passage. But the reality is this parable fits into a much larger context in Matthew. Take a look at the very first, and it might depend a little bit on what version you're looking at in your text, but go to the very first word in the 24th verse of Matthew chapter 7. Take a look at it. What's the very first word? Therefore. Probably therefore in most of your texts. Therefore, and you guys know what this means, that it's pointing back to something. Because you don't ever just start, and you've heard this joke before, of course, but let me do it too. You don't ever just start a sentence with, and therefore, can you please feed the dog? I just don't have time this morning. I'm running late as it is. That's a sour joke over here because my wife is over here and she usually feeds the dog. But therefore usually comes after you've made the case for something, right? And so Jesus starts this parable or this phrase with therefore. And that's because there's been an enormous case that's been made leading up to this therefore and leading up to this parable of the wise man and the foolish man. And if you look back through the remaining parts of chapter 7, or all the parts of chapter 7 that precede this, and you look back through chapter 6, and you look back through chapter 5, what are you looking at? Slow down, please. I can't hear everybody at once. Yes, sir. Thank you. I appreciate it. I'll get you that $5 I owe you. You have the Sermon on the Mount. Go back to chapter 5, which starts with the Beatitudes there, and do me a favor, just sort of flip through, look at some of those topic headings, look at some of what Jesus is talking about in 5, 6, and through the first parts of chapter 7. Just take a look at it for a moment. Don't be afraid to look down. I'm going to give you a second. There's some pretty big things there. What are some of the hot topics that Jesus spoke about in that sermon? Talks about marriage. Love your enemies. Talks about prayer, models of prayer. Ooh, service. Service to those people that you might not want to serve. Second mile service. Don't worry. Think about the right things. Don't worry about what you can't change. Don't worry about what doesn't matter, as much as we like to do it. Relationships. Relationships within the church. Relationships to those, again, who we may not care so much for or want to care so much for. Talks about what it means to be wealthy. Talks about what true investment in the kingdom looks like. Anything else that jumps out at off the page at you? Sir? How to pray? Somebody said judging, being careful not to judge. So there's a lot that's in there. And it's all sort of summarized and wrapped up as he concludes and makes a very important notion here. I'm going to try to move this. I apologize for, hopefully I don't pull my back. Draws up a very important conclusion here. And you look at this, let's read together through the text here in Matthew chapter 7, starting in verse 24. After this prolonged discussion, one of the longest discussions, I don't know these kind of facts, but perhaps one of the longest, if not the longest, singular discussion that we get to see Christ open up in on the text. And so verse 24 says this, "Therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and they beat on the house, and it didn't fall, for it was founded on the rock. But everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand. And the rain descended, the floods came down, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it fell. And great was its fall." So there's a real contrast here. And Jesus really makes a very important point here. The difference between being somebody who is a hearer of the word and somebody who is a hearer of the word and puts it into practice. Somebody who's not just a listener. Yeah, I heard it, but did you do anything about it? Because the reality is that hearing something is fruitless. Hearing something is meaningless unless it causes some kind of reform or causes some kind of change or causes some kind of intervention in your life or some kind of action in your life. And so this is, if nothing else, an interesting little snapshot into maybe a litmus test, if you will, that Jesus would use as to whether or not you have made a change or applied the word in a way that's meaningful. Were you just somebody that heard it? Were you just somebody that read it off the text? Were you just somebody that sat in the pew and listened to the sermon? Or were you somebody that took action because of what you heard? Did it cause a change within your heart in such a manner that you were compelled and you were forced to go out there and do something with what you learned? Because that's the real measurement. Now, this is when you think about the soft sand and you think about the rocky soil, this is something like so many parables that the people in the time of Christ would have been they would have been accustomed to, they would have been familiar with. You know, Jesus tells stories when he uses the parables that people can understand, very common, very simple to understand. We can understand it too. Everybody in here has seen maybe pictures of those California beachside houses that cost tens of millions of dollars to build, and then when the waves come in, you know, the soil underneath kind of washes away. We can get that. It would have been very common during Jesus' day for people to sort of be transient and maybe move into a town and move out of a town and leave one place and go to another place. And of course, when you're coming in, you've got to build a new house, you might build a new shop, you build a new dwelling, and you have to make a decision, of course, where am I going to build it? Because, I guess the realtors say location, location, location. You've all heard that joke or that anecdote is the most important aspect of real estate. That's always been true, probably, even back in this time. And so the question becomes, where am I going to build my house? Where am I going to build my shop? Where am I going to build my dwelling? And, of course, you get a couple of options. Am I going to build it on the hard rock, that hard, firm soil? Tough to deal with, tough to dig into, tough to really plant that firm foundation. Or am I going to go to that soft, sandy soil? There's something very enticing about that soft, sandy soil. Let me give you kind of a little bit of an anecdote. Some of you guys know that my dad, for a very, very long time, built swimming pools. If you didn't know, he built swimming pools for much of my life, about 40 years. And he still, although he works, he's a government contractor now, works out of NAS, he still builds swimming pools on the side. And growing up, I would always work with him. And so I got to know the soil of Clay County, Duval County, St. Johns County, all the areas around pretty well. And boy, there were some parts of town that you just didn't want to build a pool in because there were layers upon layers upon layers of clay. Some of you guys live in Orange Park, and you know what those layers of clay are like. You dig down with the shovel, and you just get this really, really gummy stuff. The reason I hated doing it as a kid was because, as the backhoe starts digging into the soil, all that clay and all that gunk, it's mucky and sticky and hard, and it's just terrible to work in. It's a great foundation, but it's terrible to work in. I didn't like that soil. What I really loved were places like out in Lake Asbury because it was really sandy and the backhoe would go right through it. But when the rains came, which do you think, if you had an open hole, which do you think held up? It was definitely the firm, sticky stuff that nobody liked to dig through. In fact, I'll share with you one other anecdote. Don't be concerned when I tell you this, but my dad had a minor, I don't know how to describe, a minor heart um, episode. He had a little bit of a little tiny heart attack. He would not describe it as that, about a month ago. And he had to have a couple of catheters put in. Like, is that what they call them, catheters? Stents, I'm sorry. Had to have a couple of stents put in. And he was out. The doctor said, okay, it's been a week or two. You can go out. You can start being physical again. And he had a side job, a pool that he was actually building. And I said, Dad, we went to the cardiologist. And I said, you really probably ought not be doing this kind of physical work right now. Don't you think that's probably a bad move, a bad decision? And his response was, it's soft soil. It's no big deal. I'll be able to move it around. So that soil really, really makes a difference, when you start thinking about that. Now, obviously, this is representation of something. This is imagery for something else, okay? Lots of different things, perhaps, in the wheelhouse of when you start thinking about the firm foundation, building your home or building your life, if you want to just connect the dots, on Christ, building your life on living a godly way, building your life in a manner that is directing you to heaven, and that's soul-fulfilling, and that's good for you and good for your family. When you start thinking about all of those things, why is it that people are attracted to the soft sand? Because what I just described to you, the firm foundation, the living a life for God, living a life based on the principles that are outlined in the Sermon on the Mount, those are all very good things. None of those things that we mentioned when we started talking about what was described in the Sermon on the Mount, nobody in here, I'm certain, would say, well, that sounds terrible, to treat your enemies and treat people with love. That sounds terrible, to have a good marriage. Nobody would say that. Nobody would say that's terrible, to invest in a good life directed towards going to heaven. Nobody would say that's a bad thing. But yet, there are lots and lots of people who choose the softer, sandier soil that's described here in the juxtaposition between Builder 1 and Builder 2. So my question is, what is so enticing about going down the broad path? Why do people do it? Why do people choose chaos sometimes? I'm sorry? Sometimes it's just the path of least resistance. When you think about this particular example that's built into the parable, boy, if you were looking for something sort of easy to just kind of get that house up, get that structure up, that soft sand that's just sort of easy to plane out, easy to smooth out, boy, that'd be nice. It's a lot less difficult at first. What else? Easier to live that life. Yes, ma'am. I would agree. Yes, sir. The Broadway. Yes, sir. What a great point. This whole idea that it's all good until you're tested. It's all good until the winds start to blow and the rains start to come and the rains produce the flooding and the waters start to rise. That's when it starts to get difficult. That's when it starts to get tough, when things get challenging, when the chaos appears. And up until that point, that's a great reality. these things appear to be very, very similar, but it's yet to have been tested. Was there another thought over here? Yes, ma'am. If my mom's doing it, if my dad's doing it, if the people who I respect at work are doing it, if my friends are doing it, it can't be a bad thing, right? Hey, if the celebrities are doing it, they all live in really big houses. They all have lots of attention. They're all stars on Instagram and Snapchat. What could be bad about that? Why else do people choose that broad path or that path of least resistance? Yes, ma'am. That's a really, really tough thing to do. To do what is ultimately in our best interest, even if it's the tougher thing to do in the moment. Because you're always conflicted. There are always these sort of inward battles. And we'd be kidding ourselves if we didn't admit it. But there's always these inward battles. Because doing the right thing, whether it be in our sort of Christian life, if you will, or in real life, doing the right thing is often the more challenging thing. And we're often conflicted because we're battling sort of the easy way or what might be more comfortable in some cases. Not just physically, but maybe emotionally more comfortable. Maybe socially more comfortable. There's all these types of battles that we sometimes have to fight. And the Bible is kind of replete with examples of really good people who did good things for God that sometimes didn't want to follow God's instructions. Can you think of a few? Who are some examples, maybe in Old or New Testament, of people who maybe didn't want to follow God's way? Jonah? There was something said over here. I'm sorry. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It's a part of that human experience. You said people want what they want when they want it. And that's just a part of that sort of tapping into our humanity and having to fight against the corporal and the spiritual. I would agree. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Somebody had said Jonah. Who's another? King Saul? Nadab and Abihu? Some of them are a little softer sometimes. You think about Moses. When God came to Moses and said, hey, you're the guy I'm choosing. This is what I need you to do. What was his first response like? God, I know you're God, but I might not be the guy. Not your best, I'm not the best choice. Yes, I know you are the great I am. I know you have always been and will always be. I know you are God, creator of all things, but you may have this one wrong. You might want to go with another choice. Let me make a suggestion to you, God. What about, you said Jonah. What was Jonah's response? God had a very specific task for Jonah, right? And God was going to do good things. There are these people, they've been terrible, but they are redeemable. Jonah, I need you to go preach the word. I need you to go to them. And what was Jonah's response? You don't really get it fully until you go to the end of the book, right? But Jonah ultimately says, God, I knew you were good, and I'm struggling a little bit with the biblical language, but I knew you were a God who would forgive and who would show your grace and your mercy. And they were pretty bad. For that reason, I felt like it was best to just sort of leave them be and let them sort of smote in their own terribleness. And so I'm going to run from you, God. I'm just going to leave. I'm going to avoid. He was like the practicing avoidance, Sometimes we do that. Yes, sir. Can you give me an example? What are the storms of life? You know, it talks a little bit about the brothers brought up the idea that, everything looks good until it's tested. The storms will come, the wind's going to blow, the rains are going to come, the floods are going to make their way up. What do these things represent? Those storms, the winds, and the rains. Challenges. Life in general. Well, what's bad about life? Life is pretty good. We're all sitting in here right now breathing God's air, enjoying God's sunlight through the windows. Everybody's probably eaten recently. We have a roof over our head. The air is conditioned to a nice, thoughtful 72 degrees. What's bad about that? Yes, sir. For a long time in my life, I thought I was well into adulthood, maybe even in my 30s, before anybody that I was really close with died. I was very close with my dad's mother, my grandmother, when she passed away. It's not been that long, 2010. And that was the very first time that somebody in my immediate family had passed away. And death is not an easy thing. In my mind, for a very long time, I thought that, death and all this end of life stuff and all the perils of just living, I would say growing older, but death comes in different forms to different people at different times in their life. I always kind of assumed that it came when you were 92, sleeping very peacefully in your bed, and then you would just sort of drift off, and that would be that. But the reality is that it's not that. There's all kinds of death that exists. There's all kinds of terrible things out there. There's all kinds of stress and chaos and troublesome and difficult things. And you're probably saying, well, why'd you bring that up? That really turned things into Bummer Town, Justin. I brought it up because I want to ask a very important question. The house that's saved, is that a life that's saved? Is that a physical life that's made good and saved? Kind of a trick question. Let me ask it another way. That might have been a little complicated because it sounded good in my mind, but maybe it didn't make sense. All those things that Christ pointed back to in chapter 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount that I know many of you are very familiar with, if I follow those things, will I have a great life? So can I make my life better by living those godly statutes that are outlined in 5, 6, and 7? Somebody raised their hand over here. Yes, sir. Very well articulated. I'm being a little bit contrarian right now. You know, by following these things that are outlined by Christ, by following God's laws, I may have a better physical life. Certainly, I might avoid some poor choices. Might avoid a lot of poor choices that could lead to some very troubling consequences. But I might not have a better physical life. Sacrifice, if it's real sacrifice, means struggle. It means challenge. It means giving things up. It means going without. It means not always giving in to myself. And there may be some things that I have to give up that could make life a little bit more palatable. And it doesn't necessarily mean that I will avoid illness. And I definitely won't avoid death. Yes, ma'am. It's not just about the physical. And so you connect what was said here with what was said over by JC just a moment ago. You know, the decisions that we make here in this life adds each foundational brick and each foundational stone every time we make a good choice, every time we find solitude in the Word of God, every time we fall back to the truisms and to the truths outlaid by Christ in chapters 5, 6, and 7, we're building that house. But as was said, it's not a physical house, it's that spiritual house. In fact, in many ways, I think cases could be made that God, and I want to be very careful here. Please understand that I'm going to say something and I want you to take it with the purest of intentions. In many ways, God perhaps is not nearly as concerned with our physical life as we are. I want to say that, and I don't want you to take it harshly. I'm not saying God doesn't care about us. I'm saying that God has a view that we don't have. He sees past the physical and the temporal, and he sees to the spiritual. And it's so difficult for us to see past that sometimes because we take the view of the builder that just wanted to get the house built. But he didn't realize that at some point in time it was going to be tested. And at some point in time the challenges would come, and the challenges would overtake that house that was built on the soft sand. Yes, sir. Using the right measurements. I'm just saying using the right measurements, right? I mentioned that my dad builds pools. You know, job one on building a pool, the thing that takes the most time and is the most annoying, is the very first thing that you do, and that is breaking out the level and the transit and making sure that the water line is not going to be, because water is always going to be level, right? And so the pool can't be tilted or else all the water will spill out and the tile will look weird. You just can't do that. And so you got to make sure that everything's level. You got to make sure that you can build the most solid structure with all that concrete and all that steel, but if it's an inch off, it's trouble. Look at the Leaning Tower of Pisa, right? It loses about a half an inch or so every year, every couple of years. And is it tilting back now? big insurance companies. I'm not sure. Yes, sir. Thought. What would really, really lead to a strong foundation? What really, really makes for a happy, pleasing life to God? Go back to the beginning, as you mentioned. I want to go back there, that you brought it up, to chapter 5. Let's go back there. Turn in your text to the very beginning of Matthew chapter 5. Because the reality is that Jesus suggests, of course, that the house can stand, and it's the house on the rock, but the house on the rock is the soul that trusts in him. It's the Christian who hears and does. Let me say that one more time. The house that's going to stand is the one, or represents the Christian, the believer, who will hear and who will do. Well, what was it that they heard? Well, they heard a lot of things that day. But as was mentioned, all this starts in the beginning of chapter 5. So you look back in the beginning of chapter 5, you used the term happy, the Beatitudes. The term, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but the term beati means happy or blessed. They could kind of be used interchangeably, I believe. And Jesus says this: when he saw the multitudes, he went up on a mountain. This is the beginning. And when he was seated, his disciples came to him, and he started talking, opened up his mouth, and he taught them, saying this. Verse 3, blessed are the poor in spirit. Verse 4, blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who are persecuted. That's what he was saying, amongst a whole lot of other things. But that's not easy. That's tough. And when you're going through some of those things, you may not feel real blessed. The line for persecution is oftentimes short. The line to be a peacemaker, that can be a short line too. Those who are seeking real, legitimate thirst and hunger, not just of a corporal nature, but maybe of an inward spiritual nature, if you will, that line's pretty short too. These are tough things, but blessed are they that experience them. Because every time we go back to God, every time we empty ourselves, every time we make it through a challenge, when we lean back on God and allow him to become stronger when we are a little bit weaker, brick by brick, we're building that very firm foundation in a magnificent house that can take on the storms. It will still stand, but it may have to go through some stuff first. And that's the real challenge. In a room with, I'm not sure, we maybe have 60, 70 people in here, maybe a little bit less. A lot of you guys know me. I know a lot of y'all. In a room like this, there are a lot of people that are going through some things. And sometimes it's very difficult to discern why. Even after a very long life devoted to God, sometimes people still have to pose that question, why? Why am I experiencing this? Why am I struggling with this? Why am I being faced with this challenge? Why am I having this right now of all times? This would have been okay 5 years ago. This would have been okay 5 years from now. But why am I dealing with this right now? right now is a great opportunity to add another brick to that firm foundation. And as we close out, I want to leave you with one other consideration. And this is something that really hits me in the heart, and I know will you as well. Don't let people build alone. Are y'all with me? Don't let people build alone. Don't let people go to the job site by themselves. Very difficult to do this by yourself. Near impossible. That's why we've got family. That's why we have the church. That's why we're called brothers and sisters. If you need help, if you're struggling with something, I hope that you reach out to a brother or sister. If you're a brother or sister that has the opportunity to assist and support, I hope that you're finding a way to make a difference in somebody's life. Because we can't do it alone, and we won't build that firm foundation by ourselves. It's nearly impossible. Caleb, would you close us out in prayer? Thank you.
Additional 1,100 square feet. We are Chip and Joanna Gaines. We take the worst house in the best neighborhood and we turn it into our client's dream home. Do you have the guts to take on Fixer Upper?
Chris, thanks again for inviting me to the softball team. I'm new to the area, new Christian, and trying to look for a home, and I was hoping you'd have some advice for me.
Yeah, so what are you looking for? Are you looking for something that's permanent, something that's a little more flexible, something that you can build a family in, or maybe you're looking for something just for you?
Well, and that's the issue, because I think I want something that's fun, easygoing, not a lot of maintenance, where I can have some parties still kind of live that, kind of worldly life, and so, I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, you know what the Bible says. The Bible says in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 24 that he who hears Jesus' sayings and does them is like a wise man who built his house on a rock, on a good permanent foundation. And, the rains descended, the floods came, the winds blew, and it beat on the house, but it didn't fall. But if we don't listen to Jesus' sayings and we don't do what he says, then it's like we built our house on the sand. So you might really want to start thinking about something a little more permanent.
Yeah, you're right. And I do hear you. I hear, that I need maybe a firm foundation, but I don't know if I'm so worried about a foundation. I think I can get by with my party house, but I don't know. I'm still torn.
Well, the choice is yours. You got to make the decision. And hopefully I can direct you in the right way and lead you maybe to making the right decision and help you do that. And I think I got someone I can call.
Okay.
And call them and see if they can help us out too.
That'd be awesome. Thank you so much, Chris.
So I just got off the phone with our buddy Chris. He's got a friend of his at a softball game tonight that's just moved to the area. So he's not sure exactly what the different areas are here in town. What do you think we could do to help him out?
Well, he was talking about how he wanted a beach house, something fun, something where he can have his friends over and have parties and things like that. But Chris mentioned that he thinks he needs something with a little bit more of a firm foundation. So I think we've got a couple options we can choose from, and we'll have to meet up with Jeff and see what he likes.
All right. Well, let's go head towards him.
Okay.
Hey, Chip.
Hey, Jeff, how are you
Hey,
doing?
Jenny, how's it going today?
Good. You ready to go see some houses today?
I am. You talked to my buddy Chris, right?
I did.
Okay.
We were just talking about that a little while ago. We have 2 houses for you. I think
Cannot wait.
you're really going to love them.
All right.
All
I'm
right.
excited.
Let's go.
All right, let's go.
All right, Jeff, we just made it to our first house. Came down Broad Street, and it's right there, right on the beach, the sinking sand castle. How cool is that?
I love it.
This place is just magnificent. You have all the sand everywhere. It's sitting right on that foundation of sand. It's perfect. It is cool. All we need to know, what's the cost?
Final cost? True failure.
Okay.
Why don't we go take a look?
Let's go.
All right. Jeff, house number 2, the Rock Solid Homestead.
Okay.
This house, it's a little bit further out. It's on a narrow street. It's a drive to get out here, yes. But it has a rock solid foundation. It's got a firm foundation.
Okay.
You're gonna have to live a little bit harder out here. You're gonna have to cultivate the land, do a little work. It's not always gonna be really easy, but I think this house has some potential. I think you're really gonna like this house.
Okay.
So why don't we go, what's the final cost?
What? Final cost? Final cost is true success. And you're all about that.
That's a good price.
Good price, it's a great price. You
It is within my budget.
want to take a look?
Let's go.
All right, let's go.
All right. Now that we've seen both houses, let's kind of go over some of the key points, okay? All right. So the sinking sand castle, that was the first one we saw. Great location, easy to maintain, close to everything, low maintenance. You have it located right off of Broad Street, so you got plenty of room. Tons of people will pass by and see your house. It is awesome.
It's true.
You can have a carefree life, come and go as you please. You got that broad road. Everybody, you can go up and down it, no problems. You have a fun party house. Invite all your friends over. Whatever. However you want to do it. Just remember, the foundation is sand. And the cost is true failure.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Or we have the Rock Solid Homestead. Now this house has a firm foundation. It is built on solid rock.
Okay.
The house itself is going to require a little more work to maintain than the other house on the sand. You're going to have to cultivate the land. It's on a narrow road. It's a little more difficult to get to. It's out of the way. But in this house, you can weather the storms of life. This house is built to last. The cost for this house was definitely within your budget because it is true success.
Okay. Now, what you keep talking about true success, true failure. What is that? What does that mean?
Well, you gotta remember, true failure just means living your life and not going to heaven.
Okay.
True success is living your life and going to heaven.
So,
You know what? After thinking about it, weighing the pros and cons, still thinking about that arcade.
Yes.
But I think I'm gonna go with the Rock Solid Homestead.
awesome.
I think that's a great
We
choice.
need to call Chris.
Yes.
Yes,
Let's
yes.
do it.
I love demo day. Jeff, it was so great working with you today. Having this house that you chose is just perfect for you. It's a life changer. Your soul will end up in heaven because of it. You're building your faith on the Word. I can't imagine. You came from wanting to be built on the sand, having the high life, being able to party all day, party all night, and now you have a foundation. This is awesome. Jojo, anything you want to add?
Enough already. He just wants to see his house. Are you ready to see your fixer-upper?
Yes. Awesome! Awesome!
The wise man built his house upon the rock. The wise man built his house upon the rock.
Wise man built his house upon the rock. Wise man built his house upon the rock.
The wise man built his house upon the rock, and the rains came tumbling down. Oh!
Oh, the rains came down and the floods came up. The rains came down as the floods came up. The rains came down as the floods came up, and the house on the rock stood firm. The foolish man built his house upon the sand.
The foolish man built his house upon the sand. The foolish man built his house upon the sand.
Foolish man built his house upon the sand. Foolish man built his house upon the sand. And the rain came tumbling down. Oh!
The rains came down and the floods came up. The rains came down as the floods came up. The rains came down as the floods came up, and the house on the sand went splat.
Splat!
Splash. Yeah.
Mom, Jeff!
Oh, la, la.
My name's Jeff.